been a week, right? Just to start us off, give it a sense of it, 82% of Britons consider the UK to be in a bad state, including 36% who see the country as being in a very bad state. With that in mind, we're going to come back to it. Some good news, perhaps, that there might be a rapprochement, a meeting of minds between Harry and King Charles. King Charles having cancer treatment. It's got to be a good thing, but no wills.
Of course it's a good thing. And, you know, families fall out. All sorts of families fall out. Show me a family that is perfect and there aren't cousins and uncles and others you don't... Or sibling rivalry. I mean, we know that in politics, don't we? Look at the Miliband brothers.
Yeah.
But, you know, let's hope that there's, you know, a way through this. I mean, the problem for them is everything's done in the public gaze. I was hearing about they've got various aides meeting together as if it's trying to organise a sort of, you know, United Nations type sort of meeting.
It might feel like that to them,
maybe
though,
it does.
Yeah.
The problem is, as time goes on, it's 18 months, isn't it, since they've met. The longer the time away, sometimes the harder it is to come together. So, you know, I mean, I think sometimes Harry has acted a bit like an idiot, but I wish him well. You know, families have this, parents have this with their kids, and kids have this with their parents.
The difficulty is, it's been 19 months, Anita. We've got Prince Harry perhaps going to see King Charles. We know that he's given interviews to Oprah, etc., where he's not just bared all, but he's been, to say the least, not exactly discreet. That's the kindest way of putting it. It seems to me, if you were the King Charles, wouldn't you be rather worried about having a meeting with Prince Harry?
Well, and also Spare, you know, the book that really was a kind of a tell-all in every sense of the word. I think at some point, though, you do have to... You have to thaw the relations. You have to recognise it's the prodigal son coming home. You have to thaw that. You have to welcome him back with open arms. And that is really the only way to get the relationship onto a firm footing again. And I think, you know, it's about 3 years since the Queen died. And I think that, you know, that made a huge difference to the firm and also to the family and how close they were and her ability to kind of bring everyone together. And so finding a new way through is actually really important for them.
What sort of
There's a briefing, though, isn't there, from the sort of source of, around Prince William, and it's about trust, essentially. You know, this is what the source said. William feels Harry has repeatedly chosen public exposure over private resolution, and that the royal family can't keep getting dragged into the headlines every time there's a new contract to promote. Bit of a stab at Meghan and Harry's business work, fundraising, because they're supporting themselves side of it. But you can also see that, can't you? You can see that that's often what needs to be re-established, a sense of trust that whatever Harry and hopefully the King say to each other, if they do meet for the World Child Awards, it will be treated as a family is to you, not...
Yeah, and I think whoever the source is has got a point. Harry has not helped himself in all this because, you know, he has gone out and shared information that most people would say this is keep it private in a family. And on top of all that, because of his various business interests, you know, the initial marketing of the, you know, the label Sussex, you know, and all of this, he's sort of been, I think, seen as wanting to not be part of the royal firm and abide by the rules, but at the same time have all the sort of privilege that goes with that and opportunities. So he's a grown-up, he's not a kid. He's in his sort of late 30s, isn't he? Sort of mid-30s. You know, he has to decide, you know, what sort of life he wants, and in doing so, recognise that, you know, there's got to be give and take on both sides.
It would take a great deal of forgiveness on the part of the King, though, wasn't it? I mean, you're being very kind, everybody.
Well, the King, let's be honest about it, the King caused his own mother a few problems.
No, but maybe so. But he,
I mean,
I'm
to
sure,
be fair.
I just wonder, you know, is there any money in the world, any of you could be offered, where you'd sell out private secrets, private conversations that happens between you and your parents or your brother, which is kind of what happened here. He did it for money. Now, that's got to be the most profoundly painful betrayal. And I wonder, is there any money that... I mean, people out there, that's why they're so cross with Harry, to say the very least. And, you know, that's something which I think the public are really concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally not. I'm not a sort of huge defender of Harry, but I think it felt like to him he wanted security and he needed money to get it, and so felt like actually if it's not going to be provided by the firm, then I'm going to have to find ways to do it myself. And I think for him that felt like the betrayal, not having that sort of security, as in like financial security, but actual security for his family, and therefore he felt he needed to do things that he perhaps didn't want to do as a result. And so I feel like there is quite a big kind of culture clash, genuinely, in kind of how both Will and that side of the family think about privacy and what they need to do because they're part of the former royal family, and how Will and how Harry and Meghan think about that sort of privacy. So how you resolve that, that's pretty tricky.
There's also been a lot of pain, hasn't there? You can see that Harry has experienced a lot of pain. I think a lot of pain throughout the other members of the royal family that have been hurt, but you sort of hope that maybe he's working through that, even though it must have seemed like a little bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut by some of the things that he's done. And I hope that if he does come back to the Wild Child Award, that we see how he is with them, because there's been a lot of negative publicity surrounding other charities and foundations that Harry's been involved with, but he's always been incredible for this. He's wonderful individually to the children and to their parents on through this charity, and maybe it will be helpful to sort of remind ourselves of that bit of him too, you know.
I think so, and look, for those of us old enough to remember, there was a certain amount of public tit-for-tat happening between the then Prince Charles and Princess Diana in the public domain. And, you know, those children, William and Harry, as they got older... But also, that would have been in the press cuttings for them to see and hear about in terms of interviews, which always come back again. So in terms of, I suppose, one thing is, you know, there's no such thing as a perfect parent, there's no such thing as a perfect child. But children learn also from their parents as well. And again, I don't think things can necessarily get just washed over, they didn't happen, but it's coming to some sort of arrangement where you can acknowledge, if you can, where things could have been handled better on both sides and move on. And most families try to do that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Prince Harry's behaviour here has been partly inspired by how his dad behaved in the divorce.
Oh, well, I think both partners behaved, to be honest, Diana and Charles, in the way that they behaved and what went on. But, you know, that's for them to... I don't know. I'm looking as an observer over, you know, my lifetime, seeing these members of the royal family. They are closest to the truth of what actually happened and what has influenced them, and hopefully they'll try and sort something out.
Well, we do want to know what you think about all of this. Keep your thoughts and feelings coming in. And we did ask you at home, is it time to draw a line under the royal rift? 51% yes, 49% said no. So pretty close, actually. Still a lot of...
A divided nation.
Ill feeling. Yeah, divided nation. But let us know what you think as the morning goes on. Right, shall we move on to other things? Let's move on. So, today at 2 o'clock, a decision will be made, a ruling will be delivered on this injunction, on this fraught asylum hotel in Epping in Essex. It's going to be very tricky, isn't it? Because, obviously, we've talked about the fact the government has to do something with those souls in there for now, in the short term. But feeling is so high that they want this stopped. The claims of victory at the time were very strong. Not everybody in Epping, certainly. We've seen protests the other way around. But across the country, generally, it feels as though it's a boiling point. Would you want to be in that person's shoes on the ruling?
It's a really difficult one. The government, Yvette Cooper, has made it clear that by the end of this parliament they want to stop using the asylum hotels. So by the very fact they've said that suggests that they think asylum hotels are not the answer to accommodate people who aren't yet refugees. They are having their claims processed. And it was a problem for the last government as well, and has been going on for some decades now. There has to be a better answer to this. And I think, you know, there isn't an easy answer, but somehow, in this whole discussion, vast numbers of the public from all sorts of backgrounds are feeling exasperated at the lack of ability of politicians of both the main parties to try and sort this problem out under their administrations. And in some ways, for people to see that hotels in their towns are being used to house people in this way. I don't think it's good for the people themselves who are seeking asylum.
We heard from one of them yesterday on the programme who said
either.
how miserable it is being
absolutely.
an asylum seeker, somebody that was granted asylum and has since lived here for some time but had a spell in one of the hotels. Not to interrupt you, but just to say absolutely miserable for those in there, miserable for the whole situation.
The big problem here with the court case, I mean, so Lord Justice Bean, who will have already written his judgment, just to be clear, so how the law works, the parties will know now, as we're sitting here.
They'll be writing their press releases.
Right, what the outcome is. It's been embargoed till 2 o'clock. But at the heart of it, right, you've got the government lawyer who's saying, look, this is in the national interest. That overrides local planning rules about how you can use certain buildings. So the government are entitled to, in effect, requisition these hotels, which is their argument. But on top of that, they say, look, the Home Secretary, in national law, but also international law, the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 3, means that she has an obligation to ensure that people are housed. Otherwise, it would be cruel and degrading to them. Now, that's a human rights issue. When you ask people from the government whether or not we should withdraw from the Human Rights Act, we don't get a clear answer. Do you think that's part of what's making the public so cross, that we cannot do things because of what's happening with a law that we have no control over?
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think that sometimes in this country we tend to kind of assume that all our hands are tied and we give away power that way. Because actually, if you look at what happens in Germany or Sweden or in Denmark, they have pretty tough policies when it comes to tackling migration and people seeking asylum specifically. They're pretty tough on deportation, for instance. And that is possible even though they're members of the ECHR. So I think that actually the government needs to show more creativity in how it ensures that it gets back a grip on this, because it's very clear, unequivocally clear, from your audience and the public in general, that they are frustrated by the current system. And actually, you're right that this very specific example of the Asylum Hotel is an example of some of the frustrations the public feel. But unless the government gets a grip of that, then this situation will continue, whether it's about one asylum hotel, all asylum hotels, or other aspects of immigration policy.
And I think the trigger is, Caroline, that Rob's referring to there, is when people hear that top line, that the government is arguing that the human rights, we had it in our headlines, that the human rights of those in the hotel are above the human rights of people here. What they hear is that and think, hang on, that doesn't feel fair.
And it doesn't sound fair, does it? Because it's easy to say something like that, then to try and explain what you mean by that, and the context, you know, could take, you know, all morning, couldn't it, at least? I think
well, European Convention of Human Rights was voted into national law. I think you were in the government when that happened. So it's not an international treaty, it's actually part of British law.
But one of the reasons why I think it was Jack Straw at the time did want to do that, Rob, is because actually he was concerned about the European Court. And again, this isn't part of the European Union. This is something separate. It was brought into being after World War II, and we helped to write it, was because they were worried that judges in Strasbourg were processing claims from the UK, and if we had a Supreme Court here, we could do it better because we could be on the ground and do that. Germany, I understand, has suspended, I think, parts of the European Convention of Human Rights in terms of dealing with their own problems, like ours, in the numbers of asylum seekers coming forward. So I think Anita's got a point here, is there are some aspects of the European Convention on Human Rights I think absolutely vital. I think what it boils down to in many respects is the interpretation today of some rights that were brought in the aftermath of World War II in relation to what rights, if you like, trump other people's rights into communities. And let's be clear about something here. Lots of other European countries, safe countries, have actually declined some of the people coming across the boats their rights to asylum, but then they can do a fresh claim here. Some countries, for example, provide accommodation, but not in hotels, not in rented private accommodation, but in volume accommodation within their borders. So everybody does this slightly differently. So the question is what is proportionate and what is right here? But also, more importantly, what are we going to do to try and reduce the flow of people coming on the boats? Because that is the most invisible aspect here of what people are really concerned and upset about.
I think it's also partly having people in the community. You know, there are parties arguing they should be in camps. reform is one of them.
Well, yeah.
What would you see as wrong with that?
I actually don't personally. I mean, I think a camp should have good sanitation. It should have good accommodation. But I don't actually see anything personally wrong with that. We had RAF bases and others. I think Farage has talked about that. He's refusing to say where they are. But the truth is, it's not been invested in for decades now. And therefore, to move from the asylum hotels to another form of accommodation...
Would it be like building a lot of prisons?
Well, I mean...
It'd be expensive,
Well, it depends. It depends the level of what you're going to do. Don't forget, we also had, the Biddy Stockholm barge was an option. Now, Labour was against that. And then we had the awful thing about Legionnaire's disease and all this sort of thing. But some countries do that as well. A number of these asylum seekers, mostly men, we know very little about. Often they are undocumented because they've destroyed their documents. And don't forget, they are in the process of claiming asylum. Once someone comes a refugee, they would be actually provided within the community longer-term, obviously, support and accommodation and opportunity to work. But when people arrive, we don't know at the point they arrive whether they're legitimate asylum seekers or not. And as I said, some of the people have had their asylum claims turned down in a number of European countries before they arrive here.
I think about 68% ultimately when they go through the courts. That's another conversation because the courts are so backlogged. Do in fact get asylum. You know, you'll be aware, Anita, that Kemi Badenoch has come out to say and said, look, we're not just going to deport the men, but women and children too. There's politics here. You'll, of course, both be aware that Reform is ahead in the polls in respect of both parties. It seems like both parties, and this is a real concern of people who are counter-protesting, let's say, outside the Bale Hotel, that there's a movement to the right. And at the heart of all of this, the people are forgotten. And we use the term asylum seeker, migrant, and so on and so forth. But actually, they're people, just like anybody else who is searching for the promise of democracy and freedom here. And 68% of them will, in fact, be granted asylum. Now, isn't there a worry that in the course of this conversation, we're losing that? That at the heart of this, there is something of real human importance?
Yeah, I think the British people are deeply compassionate for people that have come over here seeking asylum. As you say, a lot of them are coming from countries such as Syria or Afghanistan, places that are deeply troubled and where they do need safe harbour. But the current system, it doesn't feel as though the government has a grip on it, and that is what is eroding support. Now, on the question of deportations, I actually think it's kind of odd to say we'd only deport men and we wouldn't deport kind of families if their applications aren't successful, for instance. That kind of thing happens. For instance, Sweden offers up to about £26,000 to people to voluntarily leave, and offering them that kind of financial support and all sorts of things does make a huge difference back in countries where they've come from. So there is a way to be compassionate about supporting people to voluntarily leave the country, and I don't think that's an indication that it's a hard immigration policy.
What I mean is,
the lack
at
of
the moment, it's
is
out there. Sorry to interrupt you. There doesn't seem to be anyone from any political party that's kind of making the case for why migration might be important.
Because
here's the Liberal Democrats, who definitely are, by the way. But yes.
the issue, I think, look, I think migration happens. We have something like 1 million people or something coming in a year on migration. You know, we have people coming in through legal routes to come and work in this country, to come and study in this country. This is a different area, and part of the problem in this area, which has grown over a number of years now, is around illegal routes. We shut down under Labour, and it continued under the Tories, using lorries and other ways to get across. And then we saw in 2018 the boats becoming a feature. That's an organised crime, as we know, is in this. People are against... I don't think people are against migration if it's done in a proper, organised way. But I think people feel frustrated in the inability of different governments for all the rhetoric to actually find a practical and workable way to both make it harder for people to come here illegally, but also at the same time execute a policy that means that people's claims are dealt with quickly. Those who are actually upheld, we get them into the community, get them into work, and deport the rest. Now, Labour, since it's come in, has actually upped the number of deportations it's actually made. So I think you can be both pro-migration in an organised way, but be against some of the aspects of what we're seeing today. And the public are worried about this. It's in the polls. And no matter what... And Farage and Reform and UKIP before them have seen the weaknesses amongst the main parties. And the truth is, for all the rhetoric that is being bounded around, unless Labour, but also for the Tories, come up with something that is more than just doubling down, but comes up with some practical ways to deliver better outcomes in this space, the public will become more and more frustrated with this. And it's a broad section of the public, including people from ethnic minorities as well, who also have concerns about this happening. It's not just a white concern in the UK.
No, it isn't. And I wonder if some of the sort of feeling of, which was has been expressed to our show all week for the last few weeks, a feeling of, from large proportions, not all people watching, a feeling of enough is enough. I just don't have anything left to offer and feel a sense of, you know, opening up to those in trouble. And I wonder if that's what's being expressed in the YouGov poll, or linked to the YouGov poll, that says 82% say the UK is in a bad state. 60% say it's worse in the last 12 months. There's just a feeling that that Britain is somehow broken.
Yeah, and I think that's what matters, really. This is not about whether or not people want to see, you know, people who need help and safe harbour being offered in Britain. It's actually about whether the state is able to function. And that is one of the examples of how Britain is broken, or perceived to be broken, is the fact that the immigration system and the asylum system isn't working. But there are many, many others. And I think also, Kate, that stat brings in the economy, right?
Quite.
At this moment, public services are suffering from a lack of money, and also people's pockets. The pound is not going as far as it used to. And that all leads to a massive problem that the government is not getting in front of, and that's why we see them nosediving in the polls.
Can we talk about the economy? Is anybody that you speak to that's a senior corporate figure has real grave concerns in many respects about the lack of commercial experience of anybody in the government? Yesterday, the boss of Asda, this was in the Telegraph, chairman of Asda, has warned Rachel Reeves against fresh taxes. Alan Leighton said that if the Chancellor wanted to grow the economy, she should move away from taxing everything in some way, shape or form and instead start investing in Britain. What seems to be happening...
not raid.
Right. What seems to be happening is it's a sort of almost a large corporate focus group. What the government does is it goes up and says, we'll tax this and let's just see what the public response is. Let's... suck it and see, try before you buy. That is not a grown-up, thoughtful, short, medium or long-term approach to how to run an economy, is it, Karen?
Well, I think, again, we're into the speculation season, aren't we, before there's a potential budget in the months ahead. And so people are thinking, is there going to be, a tax on the banks? Is there going to be taxes on landlords and so forth? So everybody's going to put their 10 pence in. The problem is, though, is also, and you rightly point out, is just how much the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, can show that she has a strategy in terms of what she does. And the problem about going back to this issue around the immediate concerns that people have, the government is quite right to prioritise a growth strategy, but they've also said that's not going to be done in one parliament. So they're up again in a rock and a hard place. They want to develop the opportunity to develop more investment, because that's been sadly lacking in the last 14 years or so. But at the same time, there's these immediate problems like immigration, but also the rising number of people who are working age who aren't in work as well. And so, yeah, it is a really difficult time on all fronts. And what the Chancellor has to show, that she's not going to sort of just cherry-pick the latest idea for a tax somewhere. She's got to have a coherent strategy to actually have a fiscal plan to run the economy better.
And with a £50 billion budget hole, that's the speculation is mansion tax, gambling levy and an income tax freeze. Do you think any of those will happen? Or all of them?
I mean, I think at this point it's sort of throwing ideas at the wall. I mean, this summer has been endless sort of little pockets of money that you could potentially find. I mean, I do want to take issue with Caroline's point around the government's priority is growth. The government says its priority is growth. I think it's very difficult to argue that it has done everything possible and really put growth first, because ultimately that is the only way out of the hole. And you talk about reform of welfare to ensure that people can get back to work. The government tried to shave off a very modest amount and introduce a very modest amount of welfare reform, and ultimately the backbenchers, they couldn't get it through the government.
Anita,
these are not the fundamental reforms that the state needs.
But let's not forget, you know, we had all the promises from David Cameron and Osborne about how they were going to fix the economy. They sucked the life out of spending on public spending, and also during their period we saw rising rates of people actually who were not in work. because they cut back so drastically in some of the areas to actually get people into work. The universal credit system was the brainchild of Ian Duncan Smith. Yep. And one could say that actually that hasn't worked, even with his best intentions. So, you know, they have inherited a problem that is hard to put right. And we haven't really had growth in this country for 20 years, I would say.
I agree with that.
So I think, you know, it's not started on the day of the election and of last year.
I agree with that, but we've had a year with no welfare reforms, with no welfare proposals that are going to significantly tackle that problem that you just highlighted, which definitely got worse in the pandemic.
Yeah.
There aren't ideas there. And so instead, you end up with these tiny pockets of taxation that could massively hurt the economy further.
But we also had, following Brexit, an end to freedom of movement, but under Boris Johnson, basically opening the opportunities for non-EU people to come in and work in our economy. So when we go back to the migrant situation, that again is something we don't talk about, is the rising numbers of people not growing our own workforce here and educating workforce here and reskilling workers here, but relying on getting cheaper labour from overseas.
Part of the antipathy towards politics and also how people feel about Britain is that, you know, when you ask politicians on both sides of the aisle, there doesn't seem to be clear blue water between any of them. There's a lack of trust, faith and confidence in the quality of our politicians. I see you both nodding. It's a new generation. I wonder, I mean, what is the big vision of either side of the political aisle? It's a bunch of management consultants, many people say.
I mean, I sort of wish. I think that the challenge we have right now is that actually, what is a diagnosis for how we've gotten here, and what are the big and radical ideas that are going to drastically change our position? Because if the mainstream parties do not provide that, then we see more insurgent and more populist forces who don't have the answers, but are riding a wave of grievance that won't lead our country in a positive direction.
And at the moment, the polls bear that out. I want to end very quickly on Boris Johnson's holiday beard. It sparked all sorts of... Caroline's been away travelling, come back without...
I didn't grow a beard.
What do we think of it? What do we think of it? Is this an elder statesman look, or is he just throwing away the razor? What do we think?
I know lots of male colleagues and family members, including my own husband, that when they're on holiday, they leave the razor at home and like to go. What's interesting is how white and grey he's sporting a flintlock there on his face. And how golden and lustrous are his,
the lustrous locks of Johnson.
I think he looks quite relaxed.
As you know, Kate, there's nothing wrong with a blonde beard, as you know.
There's nothing wrong with a blonde beard at all, especially when it's natural,
Exactly, thank you very much.
Especially when it's natural.